Oh gosh, I started my career actually in fine art, and then I kept following my ideas that I wanted. My ideas were outracing my ability to actually create them, which has got me into computer graphics. And then from there, I got into computer animation. And then as I got into the industry, which was actually somebody I knew, that's usually the way it is, you found your way into animation, and I just loved it from there. And when I started working in animation, it was the experience where I wanted to know everything there was about it. And so I went everywhere in the studio, looking at every different part and how they all fit together. And I thought it was much more about the actual making of the animation. And after I'd been there a year, what I learned was it was really about the story and how it connected everybody. But like everybody else, I thought it was all about the technical initially. Oh my gosh, every film has something about it that you like better in that film than you like in something else. There was the technique in Tarzan that I loved, but then Chicken Little was really made for kids, and I really loved the way they addressed it and the humor they had. But the one that really touched me was Mulan. How she kept switching, she had to switch from being a girl to pretend to be a boy, and how that was communicated and how they blended it with the culture. And what was fascinating is when I was at Disney, I went to the studio that was actually making Mulan. So that helped too. And I thought, oh, it'd be a big fancy building, but it wasn't a fancy building. It turned out it was these old buildings all put together. They were making their brand new building, but they hadn't done it yet. And I went, all this beautiful animation came out of these terrible buildings, it's terrible. But then they could do anything to the building because it didn't really matter. So that was fascinating. Though I really have to go back, you're asking my favorite, there's actually an old animation Disney did called Rescuers Down Under from the late 1980s. And there's this scene where the boy falls off the cliff and the bird dives down after him. And I just love that scene, how he rescued him and they flew into the sky. And that's just like one of my favorite scenes. Just the sound and everything goes together. And I thought, oh, that's pretty original. And what I realized is there's scenes like that that work so well, other people borrow from them. So when you look at a movie like Avatar, also the main character flies off a cliff with a bird and then flies in the air. So there's certain things that get recycled just because they work so well. But you have to find out what part you really fall in love with that you can incorporate. And that defines how people look at story. What really defines their personality and things they like, which goes back to Mulan, which is I just love that story and how it evolved. What's common about them is the technical aspects of you need to create characters, you need to rig the characters, you need to light them, and the texturing. Games means that you need to render them quite quickly. And the differences are actually getting smaller every year. We actually have some students that are rendering their final animation with a game engine. They're not rendering it with an animation engine, but with a game engine because the technology is evolving fast enough and the computers are getting faster. There's the difference between them is for animation, story is number one. For games, I thought, well, story is number one. No, story's number two. And that was a really hard thing for me to get through my head, that story is not number one, but mastery. And the flow of being involved in the game is number one, and story is number two. And finally, when I understood that, is the game gets better once you put the story elements into it. But what's common between them is the technical aspects. When I worked at Disney, I knew people who had worked in animation, worked at games companies, came back to animation, went to games companies. It's a similar skill set. So when I look at ICE and I look at how we're training students, I think about the basic skills and how they might transfer them into the future. They may not be doing animation, they may be doing virtual reality in the future or augmented reality. We don't know what they're going to be doing, but it'll be something different, but the skill sets are still the ones that'll be the same. The biggest challenge in my life. Now, here at ICE, I'm helping to work in the administration aspect of it in terms of coordinating with the people on how we do a good job. And administration is actually the biggest challenge in my life, is making sure the people are all working together, that I'm not interfering with their work, but supporting it along the way. So that's the biggest challenge on a career level. For me, it's about that. The other part is just, I think the other challenge on a personal level is just changing careers all the time, is I have to relearn something and it's a new skill set. And I don't know why I do that to myself. It's like some people take a job, they stay with that job and they keep going. And I keep jumping around. I work in academia, I work at universities, and then I'll go work in the industry. And then I'll go back to academia, and then I'll go back to industry. There's just something that drives me to do it, and I look for that in the students that have that self-motivation and they want to change the world. And it's so exciting because I can see it in their faces and they're going to make that difference. Oh my gosh, I wouldn't be able to really name the domestic ones right now, so I apologize about that. I love the visual effects that takes place. And what I realize in looking at different films, whether they're Chinese or whether they're from the United States or whether they're from Europe, each one has a different sensibility that tends to match the audience you're shooting towards. That sometimes you can't make it for a worldwide audience. You have to think, well, where's your box office? How am I going to make enough money back to continue? And you aim for that audience, because audiences are at different levels. It would be like me trying to make a film for India. Well, they have Bollywood. They have a certain structure they adhere to, and it matches that. What I look at in film is probably the most universal structure out there, the one that's been going for years, and that probably goes back to Aristotle in the 3rd century Greece. If you talk to all the story professionals, they all sort of go back and say that's pretty standard in terms of how we set things up. So you start there, sort of build upon it. I think the lines between the two will just continue to blur as time goes on. It won't be one or the other, because if you think about it, it isn't about it's successful or not successful because it's Chinese, or successful or not successful because it comes from Hollywood. It's just so hard to make a movie that's successful, that people respond to. It's just, have you made a movie that resonates with the public? That's really the biggest difference. I've been coming here for about the last 6 years, about once a year. This trip, I've actually been here about 2 weeks. So the project I'm most involved in is the Institute of Animation and Creative Content. That's what really excites me here about being at DeTao, is what the students are doing and how can I help in my own way of making them successful along the way. I can't wait in 20 or 30 years to see how successful they are as it continues. But that's what motivates me, that's what excites me, and that's the primary reason I'm here. Suggestions? Gosh. I think it goes back to who are you creating the story for? Pay attention to the audience and what they respond to. And I'm not talking about that you give them what you had before, but you get so involved in making it, sometimes you forget how you're connecting with the audience, and you begin to learn those techniques. Last week I was down with the Alpha animation group, and they were concerned that they had to make animation that was primarily for kids, and they said, I want to make more adults animation. I said, you sort of sneak that in, little things. It's not that you change it and aim it for a different audience, but you put something in there not only for the kids, but for the adults and people at different ages. And you can look at Pixar movies, they do that all the time. Or you can go back to Looney Tunes back in the 1950s and 60s, they sort of embedded more humor that was also for adults. So as you go forward, you need to look at the things that you respond to, make sure you collect them and reference them as you go forward in terms of how it works. Not how it looks necessarily, but how do audiences respond to it. It was such a delight to meet Max. He has so much energy. If anybody is going to be successful, it will be Max as he just continues to look at how to make connections and make things happen.